Welcome to the Aquarius Theory. In today's video, we will be wrapping up our series on Astro-Theology by reviewing the role that the planets have in Astro-Theology according to Manly P. Hall. In order for us to better understand these concepts, we're going to be reviewing Greek theology, or what we know of today in modern times as Greek mythology. Originally, the great god was called Heaven. This god was called the great father god Uranus, the sky deity. Uranus ruled supremely for a great period of time, then his kingdom was taken from him by Saturn. Uranus losing his kingdom to Saturn was the beginning of generation. This means the first orbit within the great mystery of the sky itself. Saturn is the ancient one, the old god Kronos. And Kronos represents time. They made Saturn the devourer of his own children in order to preserve his own kingdom. The wife of Saturn substituted a stone for one of the children, and by deceiving the god, Jupiter, or who we know of as Zeus, was permitted to live. Jupiter in due time took over the kingdom of his father and fulfilled the ancient prophecy that was written in space. Saturn is time, and time devours its own children. Thus, nothing born in or of time can survive time. Therefore, there was a problem in substitution. By a substitute, something that was timeless was introduced into the pattern of time. This caused Saturn to be outwitted to produce out of itself or from itself the deity Zeus or Jupiter. The ancients did not concern themselves with mere physical phenomena, so what did Saturn represent? Saturn represented to the ancients supreme wisdom. Saturn was the ancient power that must ultimately devour anything less than itself. Therefore, all things that are born from wisdom must ultimately be devoured again by wisdom. Saturn, representing creation, also becomes the symbol of death, for everything created must die. Saturn represented carrying the scythe of death, sometimes represented as the reaper, or often as the ancient person as a skeleton. Saturn was the beginning of motion, which in themselves must end. Saturn was the beginning of separation, which is itself the supreme illusion and must ultimately lead to the end of its own existence. Saturn plays many parts, often in complete conflict with themselves, but there is always one underlying principle. Saturn is both beginning and end. Saturn is hope and the end of hope. Saturn is death and everlasting life, depending upon the direction of the motions. The ancients believed from the rings of Saturn, souls were cast back into the empyrean or space. Saturn is the graveyard of all things, but it is destined, according to the Chinese, the whole world shall be a graveyard. Everything that is mortal comes under the Saturnian principle, that is the absolute tyrant. Though it seems that Saturn gave birth out of himself to one principle that could defeat him. The nature of this principle we find in the very processes of contemplation. For in the meditational mystery there is in the state of illumination that power which can escape death, the power that is born of death but comes to everlasting life. There is in the composition of all things that which is born but cannot die. This is the mystery of the soul itself. For the soul is the only thing that has a beginning in time, but an eternity of continuance. The soul, outgrowing the mystery of life, was alone capable of the experience of immortality. Jupiter survived the strategy to destroy him and in time became the master of the kingdom. Jupiter at this stage represented the infantile aspect of the soul in its potential, not in its potency. Jupiter becomes a kind of autocrat, a very tyrannical thing, because he is the symbol of imagination and because he has to do with the dream of creation. From Jupiter in his dreaming and in his mystery, there comes forth certain principles and powers. One of these principles or powers is the horn Zagreus, which is carried within his father's thigh, the mother suddenly having been destroyed by thunderbolts. This horned deity is Mars. Mars, therefore, is the next descending planetary orbit from Jupiter. Mars is the dynamic energy of the Titans or the titanic powers which force the world into existence. Mars is the power of will. Therefore, out of the experience, out of the mystery of imagination, out of the creative potency of Jupiter comes the symbol of will. Will as the directing force by means of which worlds are brought into manifestation and by which the objective life of man is maintained. Mars passes through a metamorphosis because will in itself is a very subtle thing. Out of the mystery of will comes the alternative deity, or from Mars comes Dionysus. This change is accomplished without death or without the changing of personality. Zagreus simply becomes Dionysus. The means of this becoming is a metamorphosis so gradual and systematic it is almost impossible to determine the boundaries of the myth. Dionysus is the sun. We find the solar system moving from the power of Mars to the power of the sun. The sun therefore becomes a kind of regeneration or redirection of the power of will. Out of will, the will of the creating factor of Jupiter, the will born of heaven, comes this other kind of will, which many term the divine will. The will of man, the will of nature, the will of the universe, to the achievement of the great spiritual mystery, the regeneration of will, the transformation of will from the third aspect to the compassion aspect. So the great power to create things, to force things, to move things, is transformed from will to love. Love becomes the supreme power taking the place of will. From this, Dionysus begins his adventure that leads to his final tragedy, for it is the inevitable tragedy of love that it must perish. Love, strangely enough, dies for its world or dies into its world. The mystery of Dionysus and his adventures are equated to the focal point of the human ego, as Dionysus also represents the human spirit born of will and perfected in love. A creature created by a fiat of power, but perfected by a renunciation of power. Zagreus, or Mars, and Dionysus, or the sun, become the polarities of will, as power and love, as the redeeming power. The sun is placed in the middle of the septenary, which makes it possible for the sun to be the fourth from below and the fourth from above, constituting a point of mingling. This correlates to the exact position of the heart in the human body, or the chakra system, which is suspended by the focal points of creation and generation. This is also the middle ground of the soul or the psychic field. The sun or ego, standing in the middle part of the great septenary of the soul sphere, has the right and power to extend its rays upwards towards the contemplations of causes, which is creation, or descend with its rays into the underworld to become involved with the mystery of effects, which is generation. If the sun falls into the underworld, it is there for 3 days, or degrees, buried. For it descends to the orbits of the 3 inferior planets and is finally placed within the earth, which is the underworld. Continuing the descent of the septenary, the new power, which we call the compassion or love of God, falls into its reflection or negative correspondent, or the mystery of Venus. The son, blessed of his father and bearing his father's power of divine love, representing the ego, falls into the orbit of Venus, thus turning it into sensory or sensuous love. It falls into the personal out of the impersonal, for it is descending downward into the mystery of illusion. Venus is the guardian of the garden of illusion. Venus represents the appetite of the emotional powers of the soul. Captured within these powers, the soul begins to substitute divine emotion for human emotion, substitutes attachment to life for the attachment to form, substitutes the glorification of eternals to the beautification of externals. Venus is the mistress of the oceans, born out of the sea, born out of Maya or the dream. From this orbit, the psychic nature, falling into generation, now code with emotional power of Venus, which is sensory appetite and emotion, falls into Mercury. Mercury, another factor, takes over, for Mercury is the symbol of the critical intellect. Mercury is the symbol of sensory perception, deriving its authority through the five senses. They are the senses which are the messengers of the gods. They carry the sensory reflexes from the external world to man, and from man outward to the external world. But by now, he is captured in the illusion. The intellective principle terrorizes man in its negative polarity. Mercury begins to burden him with the opinion, divides him, creates criticism, sets him upon a division of learning, of attitudes in which little by little the unities of knowledge are lost. Mercury makes you a critic rather than the knower, an intellectual rather than the wise person. The degenerating or incarnating soul falls into the orbit of the moon, the last stop before the manifestation into matter. The orbit of the moon is the manifestation of imagination. Imagination supported and sustained by sensory perception and the sensual principle of Venus. It closes upon the individual, limiting the soul more and more to a kind of life that emerges only from within itself. The ancient Greeks described imagination as the tyranny of his own interpretation of things. This imagination creates the world we live in. We do not see the world as it is, we live in a world as it seems to us. Our own disillusionment increases as our own vitality decreases. The world then closes in upon us as a terrible or hateful thing. Imagination gives us false motivations. Imagination limits us and binds us constantly with the effects of our own inward imagination. Imagination draws upon the darkening resources of our inner lives. From the descent of the moon, we land in our own personal universe because everything we perceive through our senses is immediately interpreted, causing the individual to create his own world despite the world he lives in. The earth is surrounded by a kind of humid atmosphere. The soul's descent from the moon is swept into this humidity of earth. This humidity closes upon it as water upon a drowning man, and the soul, once captured, is then intoxicated. Intoxicated by the peculiar aroma of death which is on the earth. This intoxication causes the soul to become drunk, which leads to total unconsciousness concerning its own nature or its own substance. In this unconsciousness, it is born, born as a physical being, born unconscious. But not only born unconscious, but doomed to remain unconscious, not only through the infancy and childhood, but into maturity and old age. If consciousness doesn't escape, it is never able to express itself. The soul, being intoxicated by matter, wanders about unable to free itself from the prison of the body in which it is encased. The individual must find the means to free the soul from the humidity which Socrates calls ignorance. Within each person is all the powers of the hierarchs which they have fallen from. But inherently these seven powers are the seven negative polarities or seven deadly sins of the planets. One must unlock the true power by developing the seven cardinal virtues or seven positive polarities of these powers. According to the Greeks, in order to ascend, one must ascend back through the orbits by transmuting each of the energies, by making the destroying powers the redeemers. Escape is possible, because by nature, origin, and substance, the soul is superior to the thing in which it is captured in. If the soul was of origin of any of the septenary planets, it could not ascend above its origin point. But because the soul was created above them all, it can be restored to its own natural destiny. Because the soul was enslaved rather than created, it can be liberated rather than annihilated. Thus, the soul, being superior to the world, cannot die with it. The soul can be rescued by the ascent through the 7 planets, and that the 7 powers of these planets, or sevenfold aspect of the soul, through cultivation becomes the liberators. And there you have it, the concept of the planets and what they represent in astrotheology. So typically I would give my interpretation of the information, but because astrotheology on this channel has been a series going across 3 different videos and covering a lot of great points, it's too much information and too long for me to do it in this one setting. I may have to make a whole video on my interpretation of the information. Leave a comment if you would like for me to do that. Otherwise, just understand that there are multiple traits and energies that reside within you that makes up how you perceive the world. And like I say in all my videos, perception is reality. So do with that what you will. But as always, I appreciate you for tuning in. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and make sure you hit that notification bell so that when I post a video, you'll know. And as always, peace, love, and light.